In New York's most elegant hall, a powerful woman suddenly finds herself silenced until an unlikely waitress changes everything. What begins with humiliation will lead to betrayal, redemption, and a truth stronger than wealth itself. Subscribe now and join us for this unforgettable story. The crystal chandeliers blazed above the grand dining hall, scattering light across polished tables where laughter and champagne blended with the delicate notes of a piano. Men in tailored suits leaned back in their chairs with measured confidence, and women in shimmering gowns tilted their heads just so, each gesture carefully choreographed to reflect status and refinement. The air was thick with sophistication, the kind that pressed itself onto every conversation, every raised glass, every deliberate smile. Yet in the far corner, away from the clusters of New York's elite, one table told another story. There sat Mrs. Nakamura, her posture poised and unbending, as though decades of carrying herself in boardrooms and negotiations had become second nature. She wore a dark kimono-style dress, modest compared to the sequined gowns around her, but dignified, as if each thread carried history. Silver hair, pinned neatly back, framed a face marked not only by age, but by the lines of choices, victories, and losses. Her hand trembled faintly as it rested on the tablecloth, fingers closing around a small pendant that lay against her chest. It was the only visible sign of unease in a woman otherwise known for unshakable composure. Whispers had already woven their way through the restaurant. Some diners murmured, "That's the Japanese businesswoman who built an empire in Tokyo." Others speculated, "She's in New York on investment matters." Heads turned, eyes flicked discreetly, admiration and curiosity intertwining. She was a millionaire, and her presence alone carried weight. But when the waiter placed the menu before her, the atmosphere began to shift. Mrs. Nakamura's eyes lingered on the printed English words, moving slowly, haltingly, as if each line blurred together. She opened her mouth to speak, lips parting with effort. Ken, please?" Her voice faltered, caught between syllables. The accent was heavy, broken phrases tripping over themselves. The waiter blinked, leaned in as though volume might solve the barrier. She tried again, but the words fractured into silence. Around the room, glances sharpened. Some guests smirked into their wineglasses. Others shook their heads with the subtle satisfaction of watching the powerful stumble. Even the staff hesitated, their professionalism strained as they exchanged helpless looks. What had begun as admiration now curdled into spectacle. Mrs. Nakamura, the woman who commanded empires, sat stranded in a corner of opulence, trapped by language she could not bend to her will. Beneath her lowered lashes flickered something raw, loneliness, naked and undeniable. At another table, moving quietly and unnoticed, a young waitress gathered empty glasses. Clara's uniform was plain, her ponytail slightly undone from the rush of the evening, her name tag smudged at the edges. She wasn't among the elite servers who presented fine wines or carried silver trays with elegance. She was new, often tasked with clearing tables no one else wanted. Invisible in a room obsessed with appearances, she moved quickly, hoping to avoid the sharp gaze of her manager. But her eyes kept returning to the woman in the corner. She saw the way Mrs. Nakamura clutched the pendant, the way her trembling hands betrayed her silence. Clara's chest tightened, memories rising unbidden. She saw her grandmother at a small kitchen table years ago, speaking softly in Japanese, words that her classmates never understood. Clara, a little girl then, would sit beside her, repeating phrases, translating when neighbors grew impatient. Her grandmother never mastered English, even after decades in America. And now, watching Mrs. Nakamura falter under the weight of incomprehension, Clara felt those childhood evenings return with sudden force. Her tray clinked as she set it down on the counter. She hesitated, torn between fear of breaking protocol and the tug of compassion pressing her forward. The manager stood across the room, already whispering to another server in frustration, glancing toward the corner table. Clara's heart pounded. She was not assigned to that guest. It was not her place. Yet something deeper whispered that it was precisely her place, because no one else could reach her. Clara wiped her palms on her apron and took a step, then another. The murmur of the room seemed to quiet as she approached the corner, her steps uncertain but steady. When she reached the table, she bent slightly, lowering her voice. She looked into Mrs. Nakamura's eyes and with careful warmth spoke in Japanese. "Excuse me. May I help you?" For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Mrs. Nakamura's eyes widened, disbelief shimmering in them. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Clara repeated gently, slower this time, and then it happened. Tears welled, and the woman exhaled a breath that trembled with relief. She answered in Japanese, voice breaking at first, then flowing, graceful and fluent. Words poured out, an entire ocean of expression that had been locked behind silence. Clara listened, nodded, responded naturally, the language of her grandmother carrying her with ease. The transformation was immediate. Where moments earlier sat a figure diminished, now light returned to her face. She smiled faintly through tears, her shoulders easing as though a weight had been lifted. Clara translated her meal preferences, guided the waiter, reassured her with patience. The diners who had whispered now stared astonished, their smirks dissolving into silence. For the first time that evening, Mrs. Nakamura laughed softly, a sound rich with gratitude. Clara stayed by her side as the dishes arrived, ensuring comfort, bridging every gap. It was not the polished accents of the elite that restored dignity, but the simple compassion of a young waitress who remembered the language of her grandmother. When the meal ended, Mrs. Nakamura reached for Clara's hand. Her grip was firm, strong despite the tremor of age. Words in Japanese followed, soft but heavy with meaning, gratitude that transcended translation. Clara's throat tightened, but she nodded, squeezing back, understanding, without needing every word. Later, as the woman was escorted out by her driver, the room buzzed with hushed conversations. Some guests were humbled, others unsettled. Even the manager, who had frowned at Clara earlier, seemed struck silent. The evening had shifted. Clara returned to her duties, her steps lighter, yet her thoughts restless. She could not shake the feeling that what had happened at that corner table was not the end of something, but the beginning. She remembered the tears in Mrs. Nakamura's eyes, the silence of wealthy strangers broken by the power of a single connection. And as she hung her apron in the staff room at the end of the night, she could not know that in a matter of days her life would no longer be the same. Clara left the restaurant that night with the sounds of piano notes still echoing faintly in her ears. The city outside felt colder than usual, the glow of neon signs reflecting on wet pavement. She pulled her coat tighter and walked toward the subway, replaying the scene in her mind. The way Mrs. Nakamura's face had softened when she finally heard her own language spoken back to her. That single moment had shifted something in Clara, though she could not yet name it. While she descended into the underground station, across the city, Mrs. Nakamura sat alone in the back of her car. The driver glanced at her once in the mirror but said nothing. She leaned back, closing her eyes, the events of the evening swirling together. The humiliation, the relief, the kindness of a stranger. Her fingers still clutched the small pendant at her chest, the one she had worn since her youth. Her mind drifted back decades, to a time when she was not the woman who commanded attention in boardrooms, but simply Akiko Nakamura, daughter of a shopkeeper in a quiet Tokyo neighborhood. She remembered the smell of steamed rice, the clatter of her father's tools as he repaired old clocks in the corner of their modest home. She remembered the way her mother's voice would rise in gentle encouragement, urging her to study, to dream bigger than the boundaries of their street. But she also remembered loss. At 23, she had married a man of influence, a union that seemed to promise stability. He was older, already seasoned in business. Yet their marriage was more contract than partnership. He spent years abroad, negotiating, expanding, chasing deals. She stayed behind, building her own path, often alone. When illness eventually claimed him, she felt no collapse of her world. The truth was, she had already learned to survive without him. Her empire had grown from there. Real estate, technology investments, cultural ventures. Each decision had carved another layer onto her reputation. People bowed to her success, envied her fortune. Yet very few ever asked if she was lonely. Very few ever noticed the silence that followed her home each night. The car slowed at a red light. She opened her eyes and watched pedestrians hurry across the street. Among them, young women with hurried steps, carrying books or groceries, laughing into their phones. A flicker of something passed over her face. She had once been that young. She had once laughed with such ease. The driver cleared his throat quietly. "Madam, we are almost at the hotel." She nodded, her voice low. "Thank you." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "There was a young waitress tonight. She seemed to help you. Should I find out her name?" Mrs. Nakamura paused. The image of Clara's face rose immediately, her soft eyes, her hesitant but steady voice speaking words of home. "Yes," she said simply. "Find out." The driver inclined his head and said, "Of course." That night, Mrs. Nakamura lay awake longer than usual. The chandelier of the hotel suite cast shadows across the room, but her thoughts lingered on the girl. Not on the wealthy diners who had whispered about her, not on the investors she was scheduled to meet the next day, but on the stranger who had chosen compassion over rules. Meanwhile, Clara's night was quieter but restless. She sat at her small desk in her apartment, textbooks spread out before her, though she could not focus. She was in her second year at community college, studying languages. Her dream was to become a translator one day, to bridge voices across divides. But tuition bills piled on the table reminded her how fragile that dream was. She worked double shifts at the restaurant, saving every dollar, hoping she could stretch her semester long enough to finish. Her roommate, a nursing student, poked her head in. "You're up late again," she said softly. Clara smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep. Long shift." The roommate nodded, already half asleep herself. "Try to rest, Clara. Tomorrow will be the same all over again." When the door closed, Clara leaned her elbows on the desk and pressed her face into her hands. She thought of Mrs. Nakamura's trembling fingers on the pendant, of the tear that had slid down her cheek when she finally understood. Clara whispered into the empty room as though to her grandmother, "I hope I did the right thing." Days passed. The routine returned, morning classes, afternoon studying, evenings at the restaurant. Yet the memory refused to fade. It lingered in quiet moments, like a shadow she could not shake. And then, one late afternoon, just as she was tying her apron in the staff room, the manager entered with a puzzled look. He held an envelope in his hand. "This came for you," he said. His tone carried a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "Delivered by a chauffeur. What's going on, Clara?" Her hands stilled. "I don't know," she answered truthfully. The manager narrowed his eyes but handed it over. "Well, whoever you know, make sure it doesn't interfere with your work." Clara nodded quickly. "Of course." When he left, she sat down, staring at the envelope. Her name was written in careful handwriting, each letter deliberate. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside was a folded note on thick paper, written first in Japanese, then translated into English. Your kindness did not go unnoticed. I would like to meet you again. Please accept my gratitude. A. Nakamura. Beneath the note lay a simple card with a name embossed in silver and a phone number beneath. Clara exhaled shakily. She had never held something so formal, so out of place in her world. For a long moment she only stared, as if the card might vanish if she blinked. Then she slipped it into her apron pocket, her heart beating fast. The rest of the shift blurred by. Plates clattered, orders came and went, but she moved as though in another world, the card burning quietly against her side. When she finally walked home under the streetlights, she looked up at the night sky. For the first time in weeks, she felt as though a door had cracked open, one that might lead far beyond the narrow path she thought her life would follow. She whispered into the darkness, "Why me?" But there was no answer yet, only the sound of the city moving around her, carrying her toward something she could not yet see. And somewhere across town, Mrs. Nakamura sat by her hotel window, gazing at the skyline. She too wondered why the kindness of one stranger lingered so deeply in her heart. The winter afternoon sun slipped behind the skyline as Clara walked out of class, her notebook pressed tightly to her chest. She had spent the lecture taking notes in 2 languages, Japanese scribbled in the margins beside English phrases, her way of training her mind to shift seamlessly. Yet even as she studied, her thoughts drifted again and again to the envelope tucked away safely in her drawer at home. She had not yet called the number on Mrs. Nakamura's card. Part of her felt unworthy, part of her feared what might come of it. People like her didn't simply step into the world of millionaires. They cleared tables, they paid bills 1 paycheck at a time. As she crossed the quad, someone jogged up beside her. "Clara," the voice called, a little breathless. She turned to see Ethan, a fellow student from her language elective. His dark hair fell loosely across his forehead, and he carried his books clutched under one arm. He was always polite, always quick to smile, though Clara had never been sure if he noticed her beyond their shared classes. "You forgot your notebook last time," he said, handing it to her. Her cheeks warmed. "Thank you, I didn't even realize." He walked beside her, matching her pace. "You've seemed distracted lately. Everything okay?" Clara hesitated. She wanted to shrug it off, to say she was just tired, but something in Ethan's tone felt genuine. "Something happened at work," she admitted quietly. "I helped someone important, and now I don't know what to do." He raised an eyebrow. "Important how?" She gave a nervous laugh. "The kind of important that makes you wonder if you imagined the whole thing." Ethan studied her for a moment, then said simply, "Sometimes opportunities come when you least expect them. Don't let fear make the decision for you." His words lingered even after they parted ways. That night, when Clara returned home, she found another envelope waiting on the small table by the door. This one was heavier, sealed with an embossed crest. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a formal invitation printed on ivory cardstock. "Mrs. Akiko Nakamura cordially requests the presence of Clara Reyes at a Cultural Foundation event in Manhattan." Below the elegant script was the date, the address, and a small handwritten note. "I would be honored if you would attend as my guest." Clara sat down on the couch, the card resting in her lap. She whispered to herself, "As her guest?" The thought felt impossible, surreal. The next day at the restaurant, she tried to keep the news to herself, but her manager noticed the faraway look in her eyes. "You're not here tonight," he muttered as she carried a tray. "If you want to keep this job, focus." She nodded quickly, lowering her gaze. "Yes, sir." But her mind was already elsewhere, imagining chandeliers and speeches, strangers in gowns and tuxedos. How could she, a waitress in a borrowed dress, walk into such a place? That evening, she found herself dialing the number on the card before she could talk herself out of it. A woman's voice answered in careful English, likely an assistant. Clara introduced herself nervously, and within moments was transferred. Then came the calm, accented voice she remembered from that night. "Clara," Mrs. Nakamura said. Hearing her name spoken in Japanese from the woman's lips sent a shiver through her. "Yes," Clara replied softly. "I received your invitation. I don't know what to say." "You said enough already," Mrs. Nakamura answered. "That night, you gave me dignity when others would not. Now I ask you to stand with me again. Will you come?" Clara's throat tightened. "I don't belong in that world," she admitted. There was a pause. Then Mrs. Nakamura spoke with quiet certainty. "Neither do I sometimes, yet here we are. Come." Clara closed her eyes, drawing a breath. "All right, I'll be there." When the call ended, she felt both exhilarated and terrified. She would need a dress, shoes, a way to carry herself in a room full of strangers who measured worth in wealth. 2 days later, she ran into Ethan again outside class. He noticed her pale expression immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked. She hesitated, then told him everything. The restaurant, the millionaire, the letter, the invitation. His eyes widened as she spoke, but when she finished, he simply nodded. "Then you have to go," he said firmly. Clara let out a nervous laugh. "I can't walk into a place like that alone." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then said, "What if you didn't have to?" She blinked. "You'd come with me?" He gave a small shrug, though his voice carried warmth. "If you'll have me. I may not own a tuxedo, but I promise I can stand beside you." Clara felt her chest ease for the first time in days. "Thank you," she whispered. The evening of the event arrived too quickly. Clara stood in front of her mirror, smoothing the fabric of a simple but elegant dress she had borrowed from her cousin. She pulled her hair back into a loose bun, leaving a few strands to frame her face. Her hands shook as she applied a touch of makeup, whispering to her reflection, "You can do this." When Ethan arrived, dressed in his best suit, he offered a reassuring smile. "You look incredible," he said, not as flattery but as simple truth. Her cheeks flushed. "I feel like I'm pretending." He shook his head. "You're not pretending. You're stepping into the place you've earned." Together they traveled into Manhattan, the city lights blazing brighter as they approached the venue. The building loomed ahead, grand and imposing, its entrance lined with cars and guests stepping out in gowns that shimmered beneath camera flashes. Clara's heart pounded as they climbed the steps. Inside, the ballroom stretched vast and glittering, filled with diplomats, investors, and artists. The hum of conversations, the clink of glasses, the sweep of music from a live quartet created an atmosphere both dazzling and intimidating. Clara clutched her small purse, her eyes darting nervously. Then she saw her. Mrs. Nakamura stood near the stage, surrounded by a small circle of dignitaries. She wore a gown of deep silk, understated yet commanding, her silver hair catching the light like threads of moonlight. When her gaze met Clara's across the room, her expression softened into something rare, genuine warmth. Clara whispered under her breath, "She saw me." Ethan leaned close. "Then go to her. She invited you here for a reason." Clara straightened her shoulders, drawing courage from his presence. She took a step forward into the sea of strangers, unaware that by the end of the night she would no longer be the quiet girl who cleared tables. The ballroom shimmered beneath golden chandeliers, each crystal catching the light and scattering it across the polished marble floor. Waiters in white gloves floated between guests, balancing trays of champagne flutes that sparkled as they passed. A quartet played softly in the corner, their instruments weaving melodies that seemed to hover above the swirl of gowns and tuxedos. Clara moved cautiously at first, her steps careful, her eyes flicking from face to face. She felt the weight of the room pressing against her, each conversation tinged with the confidence of those who belonged. Ethan walked just half a step behind, steady and calm, as though his presence alone could anchor her. Mrs. Nakamura broke away from the cluster of dignitaries and came toward them, her movements graceful but purposeful. When she reached Clara, she touched her arm lightly and spoke in Japanese, her voice calm but carrying warmth. "You came." Clara bowed her head slightly in response. "Yes, thank you for inviting me." Ethan watched the exchange with curiosity, sensing the bond between them, even if he could not understand the words. Mrs. Nakamura gave him a polite nod, then gestured toward the stage where a microphone stood waiting. "Tonight," she explained softly, shifting to English, "I must give a speech. I can prepare in English, but it lacks my voice. Would you help me?" Clara's breath caught. The idea of translating in front of this crowd sent fear rushing through her. She hesitated. "I don't know if I can." Mrs. Nakamura's eyes met hers steadily. "You already did, when no one else would. Trust that." Before Clara could answer, a man in a dark suit approached. His smile was polite but edged with disdain. He glanced at Clara, then turned to Mrs. Nakamura. "Akiko, I didn't realize you'd be bringing staff tonight." Clara stiffened, her face flushing. The man's tone was smooth, but the insult was clear. Mrs. Nakamura's expression remained calm, but her hand pressed more firmly against Clara's arm. "She is my guest," she said evenly. The man's smile faltered, but only slightly. "Of course," he replied flatly, before slipping back into the crowd. Clara swallowed hard, whispering to herself, "I don't belong here." Ethan leaned close enough for only her to hear. "That's exactly what he wants you to think," he said. "Don't give him the satisfaction." The evening unfolded with layers of tension. Clara watched as Mrs. Nakamura greeted investors, diplomats, and cultural leaders. Conversations danced between languages, and Clara realized how much nuance could be lost when words were strained across borders. Each time Mrs. Nakamura turned back to her, there was a quiet plea in her eyes: "Stay close." When the time for the speech arrived, the crowd gathered near the stage. Mrs. Nakamura ascended the steps slowly, regal in her posture, yet Clara saw the faint tremor in her hand as she adjusted the microphone. She began in Japanese, her words steady, her cadence rich with meaning. The audience listened politely, but many faces showed confusion. After a few sentences, she paused and glanced toward Clara. The spotlight shifted slightly, catching Clara in its glow. Her heart hammered. Ethan gave her a small nod from the crowd, his lips forming the words, "You can." Clara stepped forward, her shoes clicking against the stage floor. She took her place beside Mrs. Nakamura, drawing a deep breath before speaking. "She says," Clara began, her voice carrying across the hall, "that tonight is not only about culture or business, but about understanding. That to truly connect we must listen, not just with our ears, but with respect." The translation flowed, her mind slipping into the rhythm she had practiced all her life. As Mrs. Nakamura spoke, Clara gave the words "new life" in English, each phrase resonating with the room. She could feel the shift among the listeners, their posture leaning forward, their eyes softening with understanding. But just as the applause began to build, another interruption broke the moment. A woman in a glittering gown, her voice sharp and loud, called out from the audience, "It's charming, isn't it? Hiding behind a waitress to speak for you? Is this what power looks like now?" The room rippled with uneasy laughter, the kind meant to mask discomfort. Clara froze, heat rushing to her face. The humiliation she had feared crashed over her in waves. Mrs. Nakamura turned her gaze toward the woman, her expression calm but firm. She spoke in Japanese, her tone sharper this time. Power is not the ability to speak louder than others. It is knowing when to let another voice carry yours. Clara translated, her voice trembling at first, then stronger. She says true strength is not in shouting over others, but in trusting someone to speak your truth with you. A hush fell over the room. The socialite who had mocked them shifted uncomfortably, her smirk faltering. Then came the applause. It started with a few hands, then spread until the hall resounded with clapping. Mrs. Nakamura inclined her head slightly, and Clara felt the warmth of triumph bloom in her chest. When they left the stage, Clara exhaled shakily. "I thought I was going to fail," she whispered. Mrs. Nakamura squeezed her hand gently. "You did not fail. You reminded them what respect sounds like." As the evening continued, Clara noticed the difference in how people looked at her. Some with curiosity, some with new respect. Yet she also saw shadows in the room, faces that did not soften, gazes that lingered with something colder. Ethan joined her near the refreshment table. "You were incredible," he said simply. She shook her head. "I nearly froze." "But you didn't," he replied, his voice steady. "That's what matters." Clara glanced back at Mrs. Nakamura, who stood once again among dignitaries, her shoulders straighter, her presence restored. Clara realized that tonight had been more than a test for her. It had been a test for both of them, and together they had passed. Yet as she sipped her water, she could not shake the image of the socialite's mocking eyes, or the faintly amused smile of the man who had called her staff. Somewhere beneath the elegance and applause, another current was moving, darker and sharper. And soon Clara would learn that not everyone in that room wished Mrs. Nakamura well. The applause from the ballroom still rang faintly in Clara's ears, long after she and Ethan left the stage. For the rest of the evening, guests approached Mrs. Nakamura, offering congratulations, shaking hands, eager to align themselves with her strength. Clara stayed nearby, translating when needed, but mostly watching, learning how the tides of power shifted in a room like this. It was during one of these conversations that Clara noticed him, a man in a tailored suit, his hair streaked with grey, his eyes sharp behind thin-rimmed glasses. He moved through the crowd with the ease of someone used to attention, but there was a deliberate quality to his smile, as though each expression was carefully measured. When he finally reached Mrs. Nakamura, he inclined his head politely. "Akiko," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "It has been many years." Mrs. Nakamura's face remained composed, though Clara noticed the faintest tightening around her eyes. She answered in Japanese, her tone restrained. "Mr. Takeda, I did not expect to see you here," Clara translated quickly, her voice steady even as tension coiled in her chest. Takeda's smile widened. "New York is full of surprises," he said. Then, with a glance toward Clara, he added, "And so are your companions. I see you've found someone to carry your voice." The words were light, but the undercurrent was cutting. Clara felt the sting but kept her gaze forward, waiting for Mrs. Nakamura's reply. "She carries more than my voice." Mrs. Nakamura said firmly. "She carries understanding." Takeda chuckled softly. "Understanding can be dangerous. Sometimes it reveals more than silence ever would." With that, he bowed slightly and moved on, leaving a trace of unease in his wake. Clara turned to Mrs. Nakamura, her voice low. "Who is he?" Mrs. Nakamura's gaze lingered on the crowd. "A rival, once an ally. He prefers shadows to partnerships. Be careful with men like him." The words settled over Clara like a warning she did not yet understand. Later in the evening, Clara stepped away to catch her breath, standing near the tall windows that overlooked the city. Ethan joined her, offering a glass of water. "You look like you've just walked through a storm," he said. She accepted the glass gratefully. "Maybe I have. There's more to this world than speeches and applause." He studied her face for a moment before speaking again. "You've changed since the night I met you in class. You stand taller now, even when you're scared." Clara laughed softly, shaking her head. "I don't feel tall. I feel like I'm balancing on a ledge, and at any moment I might fall." Ethan's voice lowered, more serious. "Then let someone stand beside you, so if you fall, you're not alone." Clara's breath caught at his words. She met his eyes and saw not pity, but steady conviction. Something in her chest shifted, an awareness she hadn't let herself feel before. Before she could respond, Mrs. Nakamura approached, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. "Clara," she said, "I will need your help again soon. There are meetings ahead, and not all will be friendly. Tonight was only the beginning." Clara nodded. "I'll be there," she said without hesitation. As the night drew to a close, the guests began to leave in clusters, their laughter echoing through the marble hall. Clara and Ethan walked Mrs. Nakamura to the waiting car. Before stepping inside, she turned back and looked directly at Clara. "Do not mistake kindness for weakness," she said quietly. "Yours is a strength many will not expect. That is why you must guard it." Clara held her gaze, the weight of the words pressing into her. "I'll try," she whispered. Mrs. Nakamura gave a single nod before the driver closed the door. The car pulled away, its taillights vanishing into the night. Clara and Ethan stood in silence for a moment, the cool air brushing against them. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low. "Whatever you just stepped into, it's bigger than either of us. But if you're willing, I'll walk through it with you." Clara turned to him, her lips parting in surprise. For once, she didn't deflect with nervous laughter or dismissive words. She simply said, "I don't want to do this alone." "Aye." And as they walked away from the glowing lights of the foundation event, Clara felt both the weight of what had begun and the fragile thread of something new, something that might become love if given the chance. What she didn't see was Takeda, standing in the shadow of a nearby pillar, watching as she disappeared into the night. His smile was thin, his eyes calculating. Whatever bond had been forged that evening, he had already decided how to test it. The city woke early, but Clara's mornings now belonged to a different rhythm, where once she spent hours rushing between classes and restaurant shifts, she now found herself slipping into quiet hotel lobbies, taking elevators to meeting rooms high above the skyline. Mrs. Nakamura had asked her to join several private discussions, and Clara, both nervous and eager, accepted without hesitation. The meetings were formal, filled with handshakes and guarded smiles. Executives spoke in polished English, careful but rehearsed, while Mrs. Nakamura answered in Japanese, her tone steady, her words layered with meanings that often slipped past direct translation. Clara stood between them, carrying messages across languages, shaping sentences so they held both accuracy and respect. One afternoon, after a particularly tense negotiation with a real estate group, Mrs. Nakamura placed a hand lightly on Clara's arm as they left the room. "You chose your words carefully," she said in Japanese. "You gave me clarity when they wished to confuse. That is more valuable than you know." Clara felt warmth rise in her chest. "I'm learning from you," she replied, but not everyone approved. Back at the restaurant, whispers had begun. Her manager, a tall man with slicked hair and a clipped voice, noticed her absences. One evening, as she tied her apron, he approached, his arms crossed. "You've been distracted," he said flatly. Shifts missed, hours rearranged. This place needs commitment. If you can't give it, there are others who will. Clara froze, the knot of her apron half-tied. I'm still doing my job, she answered carefully. He narrowed his eyes. Not well enough. Whatever side project you've got, it's costing you focus, and this restaurant won't carry dead weight. The words stung, sharper because they carried a kernel of truth. Her mind had been elsewhere, pulled toward boardrooms and speeches instead of table numbers and drink orders. Still, she bowed her head slightly. I'll do better. He leaned closer. See that you do, or don't bother coming back. That night, Clara walked home under a sky heavy with clouds. She thought of her bills stacked on the kitchen table, the tuition payments looming, and now the risk of losing her only steady income. She whispered into the dark street, "What am I supposed to choose?" The next morning she found herself again by Mrs. Nakamura's side, translating during a cultural partnership meeting. This time, Clara noticed Takeda sitting at the far end of the room, silent but watchful, his presence like a shadow stretching into every corner. When the session ended, he approached with his polite smile. "You carry yourself well," he told Clara, his English smooth. "But be careful. Words can be weapons, and standing too close to a powerful woman can make you a target." Clara answered cautiously, "I'm only helping." He tilted his head. "That is what concerns me. Helping can become loyalty, and loyalty has costs." Mrs. Nakamura appeared then, her expression calm but firm. "Takeda," she said in Japanese, her voice low, "you enjoy sowing doubt, but she knows her path." Takeda's smile widened faintly. "We will see." With a shallow bow, he walked away. As the door closed behind him, Clara asked softly, "Why does he speak to me like that?" Mrs. Nakamura's eyes softened. "Because he sees what you are becoming. He wishes to unsettle you before you believe in your own strength." Later that week, Clara sat with Ethan in the campus cafe, her textbooks spread out but forgotten. She told him about the confrontation at work, about Takeda's warning, about the heavy pull between her two worlds. Ethan listened quietly, then leaned forward. "What do you want, Clara? Not what you think you should want, not what your manager expects, not even what Mrs. Nakamura might hope. What do you want?" Clara hesitated, her throat tight. "I want to use my voice," she said finally. "I want to bridge the gaps that silence creates, but I don't know if I can live off that dream. Right now, I need my job to survive." Ethan's tone was steady. "Dreams always feel too big before you step into them. But maybe this isn't a choice between survival and purpose. Maybe this is the moment where survival means risking everything for purpose." Clara looked at him, her eyes wide. "If I lose my job, I might lose school too." He reached across the table, his hand brushing hers briefly before pulling back. "Then trust that there's more than one path forward. You're not alone in this." His words stayed with her as she returned to the restaurant that evening. Her manager cornered her near the service station, his expression sharp. "I hear you've been running around with that rich woman," he said. "Clients talk, staff talk. If you're going to keep this job, you need to decide where your loyalty lies." Clara met his gaze, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "My loyalty is to what I know is right." His lips curled in disdain. "Then don't bother clocking in tomorrow." The dismissal hit like a stone, but instead of collapsing under it, Clara felt something inside harden. She untied her apron slowly, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. Without another word, she walked out. That night, standing under the cold glow of the streetlights, fear surged in her chest, but so did something else. Freedom. She whispered into the night, "I've chosen." Across the city, Mrs. Nakamura sat at her desk, signing documents, reviewing schedules. When Clara's call came through, her voice carried both uncertainty and resolve. "I lost my job," Clara said softly. There was a pause. Then Mrs. Nakamura answered, her tone unwavering. "No, you chose your path, and this risk will not be in vain." Clara closed her eyes, relief flooding her even as doubt lingered. She did not yet know what consequences would follow, only that she had stepped fully into a world she had once thought unreachable. And in that world, shadows were waiting. Winter had tightened its grip on the city, and the wind carried a sharp edge as Clara hurried into the towering glass building where Mrs. Nakamura's most important meeting of the trip was to take place. She had been warned this was no ordinary negotiation. It involved a consortium of American and Japanese investors, the kind of partnership that could shape years of influence. Clara had been asked to translate not just words, but intent. Inside the boardroom, the air was heavy with anticipation. Men and women in tailored suits sat around a long table, polished to a mirror shine. Documents were stacked in neat piles, and glasses of water reflected the fluorescent lights. At the head of the table, Mrs. Nakamura sat poised, her hands folded, her expression calm but unyielding. Clara took her place at her side, notebook ready. The first hour passed smoothly. Mrs. Nakamura spoke in measured tones, Clara translating carefully, ensuring every phrase carried respect and clarity. But halfway through the session, one of the American executives frowned, flipping through a contract. "This clause doesn't match what we agreed upon," he said flatly. He slid the document across the table. "It looks like new terms have been added." Mrs. Nakamura's eyes narrowed slightly as she scanned the page. "In Japanese," she murmured to Clara, "these words are not mine." "Someone has altered this." Clara translated the concern, her voice steady though her pulse raced. The room grew tense, murmurs rising. At that moment, Takeda leaned forward from his seat near the end of the table. His smile was faint but unmistakable. "Perhaps there was a miscommunication," he said smoothly. "It is easy to make mistakes when messages pass through so many hands." The implication hung heavy in the air. All eyes turned toward Clara. Her stomach twisted as she realized what he was suggesting, that she, the inexperienced translator, had been the source of the error. Mrs. Nakamura's voice cut through the silence. "No," she said firmly, her words in Japanese quick and sharp. Clara translated, her voice unwavering. "She says this is not a matter of translation. This is sabotage." The Americans exchanged uneasy glances. The meeting teetered on collapse, the deal threatened by mistrust. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, humiliation pressing in. For the first time she questioned herself. What if she had missed something? What if Takeda was right? Her breath came shallow, her fingers tightening around her pen until they ached. During the recess, she stepped into the hallway, her hands shaking. Ethan had been waiting outside, his presence a quiet anchor. Seeing her pale face, he stood quickly. "What happened?" he asked. Clara swallowed hard. "They think I made a mistake. They think I ruined everything." Ethan placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Clara, look at me. You didn't ruin anything. This isn't about you. It's about someone trying to make it about you." His words steadied her, though doubt still gnawed at her edges. When the meeting resumed, Mrs. Nakamura spoke with newfound steel. Clara translated faithfully, though her voice quivered at first. Mrs. Nakamura demanded the original draft of the contract. After tense silence, one of the aides produced a version that revealed the truth. The clauses had been inserted only days earlier, without her consent. Gasps rippled through the room. Mrs. Nakamura's gaze swept to Takeda, her eyes sharp as glass. "This," she said in Japanese, "was his doing." Clara relayed the accusation, her words echoing in the hushed boardroom. Takeda only smiled faintly, rising from his chair. Accusations are easy, he said coldly. Proof is harder. Then he bowed slightly and walked out, his shadow long in the fluorescent light. The meeting ended in chaos. Though Mrs. Nakamura salvaged the agreement by exposing the tampering, the damage had been done. Her reputation, once untouchable, now carried whispers of weakness. Clara walked beside her as they exited, her chest heavy with guilt, despite her innocence. In the car afterward, Mrs. Nakamura sat silent, gazing out the window. Finally, she spoke in Japanese, her voice softer than Clara had ever heard it. "I have faced betrayal before. It never grows easier." Clara whispered, "I'm sorry they doubted you because of me." Mrs. Nakamura turned, her eyes sharp. "Do not take his poison into your heart. He wanted to break you because he sees you are not a servant anymore. You are a bridge, and bridges must be strong." The words struck deep, but so did the weight of what had nearly been lost. Clara stared at her trembling hands and thought of the mocking looks, the silence of the room as eyes turned on her. She whispered to herself, "Maybe I'm not strong enough." That night, lying awake in her small apartment, the city's noise pressing in through thin walls, she replayed every word, every glance. It was her darkest moment yet, the place where fear whispered louder than courage. But in her heart, another voice remained, the memory of Mrs. Nakamura's steady gaze, the warmth of Ethan's reassurance. And though she could not yet feel it, a seed of resolve had been planted, waiting for the moment to break through the darkness. The following weeks unfolded under a cloud of tension. Whispers followed Mrs. Nakamura through every corridor, rumors twisting the truth of what had happened in the boardroom. Some claimed she had lost her edge. Others insisted she relied too heavily on a young and untested translator. Clara heard the murmurs each time she accompanied her, and each word pressed into her like a blade. Yet Mrs. Nakamura never wavered in public. She held her head high, her voice steady, her dignity untouched. Only in private did Clara glimpse the toll it took, the faint weariness in her eyes when the doors closed and the crowds disappeared. One evening, as they prepared for a cultural gala where Mrs. Nakamura was expected to speak again, Clara lingered at the edge of the dressing room. "They're waiting for you to stumble," Clara said softly. Mrs. Nakamura adjusted her gown in the mirror, then met Clara's gaze. "Then we will not stumble," she answered. Clara hesitated. "What if I fail again?" Mrs. Nakamura's voice grew sharper. "You did not fail. He tried to make you believe that, but your voice carried me through when I could not. That is strength. Do not forget it." The gala hall was brighter and grander than any place Clara had entered before. Rows of chairs stretched toward a stage draped in crimson fabric, where dignitaries and business leaders gathered to hear Mrs. Nakamura's address. Cameras flashed as guests entered, and Clara felt the heat of the lights against her skin. Ethan had come too, slipping into the audience to support her, his presence a quiet reassurance. When the time came, Mrs. Nakamura walked to the podium. The hall fell silent, all eyes on her. She began in Japanese, her words flowing rich and confident. Then she paused, and Clara stepped forward, her voice carrying the message in English. She says, "This is not an evening for wealth or power," Clara translated, her voice growing steadier with each phrase. "It is an evening to remember that every culture, every person has a voice, and when those voices are silenced, we all lose something precious." Clara felt the words reverberate in her own chest. For the first time, she wasn't just translating. She was speaking with her own conviction, her own belief. The audience leaned in, listening, their expressions shifting from polite attention to genuine engagement. Mrs. Nakamura continued, her eyes shining as she spoke, and Clara followed, carrying her meaning into English with a clarity that seemed to break through the air itself. At the back of the hall, Takeda stood watching, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But even he could not stop the momentum building in the room. Mrs. Nakamura finished with a phrase heavy with emotion. Clara took a breath, then delivered it in English. Dignity and kindness are worth more than riches, and sometimes the smallest voice carries the greatest weight. For a heartbeat, the hall was utterly still. Then the applause began, soft at first, then swelling until it filled every corner. Guests rose to their feet, clapping, some with tears in their eyes. Clara's chest ached with relief, and her hands trembled as she stepped back from the podium. After the speech, the crowd pressed in. Reporters asked questions, leaders offered handshakes. Yet Mrs. Nakamura reached only for Clara's hand, holding it firmly. "You were my voice tonight," she said in Japanese, "and you were your own." Clara blinked back tears. "I only did what I could." "No," Mrs. Nakamura replied, "you did what no one else could." Later, when the crowd thinned and the night grew quieter, Ethan found Clara near the balcony, the city lights stretching endlessly below them. "You were brilliant," he said simply. Clara laughed softly, still dazed. "I thought I would faint up there." He shook his head. "You didn't. You stood taller than everyone else in that room." His voice lowered, steady but warm. "And I don't just mean on that stage." She met his eyes, her breath catching at the sincerity in them. For the first time, she let herself acknowledge what had been building between them. "I couldn't have done it without knowing you were here," she admitted. He smiled faintly. "Then I'll always be here." Their words hung in the air, simple but heavy with promise. Weeks later, a letter arrived for Clara at her apartment. Inside was a handwritten note from Mrs. Nakamura, along with official documents. The note read, "I have seen your gift. Let it grow. I would like to sponsor your education. Let nothing silence your voice again." Clara sat at her desk, tears blurring the words as she realized what it meant. Her tuition, her future, the dream she had feared was slipping away, all restored by the very woman she had once saved from silence. Years passed. Clara became a professional translator, her work taking her across countries, into conferences and embassies, into places where her voice carried understanding between people who otherwise might never connect. Ethan traveled with her often, their bond deepening into love, into partnership. But no matter how far she went, she always remembered the night in the restaurant, the trembling hand of a woman clutching her pendant, the silence of a room broken by a single act of compassion. She remembered the lessons of dignity, of kindness, of the bridges that only voices can build. And whenever she stood on a stage, whenever she lifted her voice, she carried that memory with her, proof that even the smallest act can change the course of a life. In the end, this story reminds us that true strength is not measured by wealth or power, but by kindness, dignity, and the courage to listen. If this touched you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your own stories of compassion and connection.